GoMRI and Sea Grant have become important players in this network and when it comes to oil spill science information flow. So again, download that report from our website and you can learn more about the factors involved in information flow with our audiences. But we also have other information available to you if you're interested. It's not formalized in a report like those other ones I just highlighted, but we have pulled together audience questions, concerns, and comments and ideas together into an Excel spreadsheet, and we've been working with core area leads to see if there's interest in receiving some of this information, not all of it, but some of it that pertains to each core area. And so you might have seen some of that floating around. And so just so you know, that comes from audience input. When they sign up to come to our seminars and workshops, we ask them if they have any oil spill related questions. And we collect all of that before our workshops, but also afterwards. We ask them again if they still have questions or concerns or things that they're interested in and they want to share with us. And so they do, and we have collected all of that input. And it is available to you if you're interested. And these are just a sample of some of those questions that we've categorized as being related to the theme of socioeconomics. And again, this is directly from them. So if there's any grammatical errors, we didn't correct for that. But you know, this is just a sample of what people are interested in across the region. And again, if you are interested in learning more about that, you can contact us and we'll share that with you. And I also just wanted to let you know that there is more information headed your way. We have been partnering with NAS Gulf Research Program and other Sea Grant programs across the nation to collect feedback from communities that have been impacted or are likely to be impacted by oil spills. And this is a workshop series that's focused more on public health and human well-being in general, but we got really in depth with these communities in relation to health, social, and economic disruption from spills. And so we have been working to collect their pilot project ideas, their research and outreach priorities, their suggestions for improving response in the context of human well-being, and other resources, needs, and issues. And so there's going to be 6 reports being released toward the end of this summer, and that might be useful information for you all, and we will be making that available to the GoMRI community, but also widely to the public when it's ready. And as I mentioned, Monica is your point of contact for Core 7, but in case there's other folks on this webinar that are working in other core areas, I thought I'd list the point of contact for all of them, just in case you want to know who to go to. You can reach out to me directly or any of the folks on my team, and we'll put you in the right direction. That's all I got. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. Thanks for helping to set the stage and also to let us know about the upcoming work that may inform these efforts as well. So with that, I'd like to invite David Yoskowitz to share his screen. Thanks, David.
Can everybody see?
We see and we hear.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together, 7B team. And I'm going to take a little bit of a higher level view at just some of the economic and social considerations of modeling in general, but integrated modeling more specifically. I'm going to advance the slide here. Okay. Apologize, hold on just a second. There you go. Okay, so this is, thanks to John Shepard, this is a figure that we're becoming very familiar with. I know from, you know, operationally, it's been easier to think about how to work through integrated modeling given the domains or bins of expertise. And today we're here talking about the socioeconomics, which obviously in an integrated system really bleeds into everything, as does everything else bleed into it. But some of the challenges that I want to highlight here that are no news to anybody that is on this call are really the scale match for the data outputs and the impact that you want to have with the modeling that you produce. And, thinking of ideally temporal and spatial, but there are others that we might want to be considering as we move forward. And I'll spend most of my time talking about that in just a moment. Some of the other challenges that I see, just in general with regards to this integrated modeling between the biogeophysical sciences and the social behavioral and economic sciences, and then the output and impact that you want to have with that work, is the modeling match. I mean, there's no doubt that there's much greater effort in the biogeophysical realm and sciences than there are in the social behavioral and economic. Now, I have an asterisk there, because here, when I'm talking about social behavioral and economic sciences and the modeling effort, I'm really talking about those efforts that are concentrated on environmental and natural resource economics. There's a lot of modeling effort that is done with regards to macroeconomic conditions of the US and the world and international trade and monetary policy, but that is very different and not really user-friendly or applicable to what we're talking about here today. But if you're thinking about just the social behavioral economic modeling as connected to environmental and natural resources, and in particular on coastal and ocean systems, it's very limited. So that's something else to consider moving forward. And third is just resource and capacity match. So resources here are not only the financial resources to do the work, but the human resources. There's just much fewer individuals in the social behavioral and economic space that are working in this area than there are in the biogeophysical space. And so that's something to consider, is where to find that expertise, and potentially looking outside traditional programs that you might pull in, individuals that may not have thought about applying their work in the environmental and resource economics space, or in particular into the coastal and ocean resources. So on the flip side, what are the opportunities? Well, from the social behavioral and economic side, we do have some strong social and economic data sets that are already collected, that we can begin to use. We will hear about some of those today, but the census is one that we're all very familiar with here in the United States, and it has a tremendous amount of information within it, along with the American Community Survey and the public use microdata sample. But once again, we get into this scale match on, how do you connect that back to, the biogeophysical models, and how do you connect that to the decision that you want to make with the results of those modeling output. And then on the biophysical side, especially as it relates to this effort, where there's a lot of looking at fishing, both commercial and recreational. The National Marine Fisheries Service in the United States has great data that can be augmented by primary surveys that others will be talking about later on. Other opportunities, well, because we do have a lot of effort in the biogeophysical sciences, there's great modeling effort that's been done there, and that's been evidenced by previous presentation in this series here, and a lot of the work that GoMRI funded projects are doing, and just beyond that. So we're starting from a really strong place within that community. But I think most importantly, over the last handful of years, there's a greater wantingness, not willingness, willingness definitely, but I wanted to put wantingness here to work together. And that's really the important first step, is identifying those colleagues that are working in these other domains and that will work with each other from the beginning of the project. So I do want to talk a minute about scale here and how this drives a lot of the work that we're doing, and I'll provide an example of this in just a moment. So we spend a lot of time talking about spatial and temporal scale, and just solving that is difficult enough. Whether you're staying in the biogeophysical sciences, or you're staying in the socio-behavioral economic sciences, or you're trying to bring the two together. that's really challenging in and of itself. But then we add all these other potential dimensions of scale that we normally don't think of. And this is some great work that Cash et al. had done back in 2006, to be thinking about the institutional scales, management scales, network scales that Chris has talked about earlier, and that this 7B has really begun to address as well. If the idea is to have impact with our modeling results, all these other scales need to be considered at the same time, and then going across these scale dimensions. So, one thing to be considering as this and other similar projects move forward. Just a couple of quotes here. I normally don't do this, but I think it's pretty important here. From Cash et al. As well. What they was really focused on are thinking about the large scale scientific efforts that, really at the local level where a lot of decision making, especially land use and planning, is made, being able to distill that down to decision makers at that local level. And that local could mean, city, county, or it could also be a regional decision making body or a state body. So being able to, I guess, downscale the science in a way that can be taken up by local decision makers is critical. And then Verbig et al. Also talk about, thinking about this mode of decision making. What is it? What is the information and the scales at which you need to work at? Now, they only address spatial and temporal here, but the scales that you need to work at to make the output relevant, decision making relevant. And so, thinking around the scale, at least in the work that we've done, has really helped us to find the questions that we want to answer and the decisions that need to be made, right? So we working with our partners have really we've helped to hone in on the scale questions. And so at the end of the day, for us, is what is the decision-making relevant scale in which we're working at? So if you want a decision relevant output, what is that scale that's going to be relevant for, whether it's your very hyper local or more regional or state body? And so let me give you a quick example of where we've been working, and this is not oil spill specific. Krista Court is going to be sharing some of the work that we've done that she's led in the past. This is another project that we've worked with Scott Hagan out of LSU and his group, looking at sea level rise, flooding, and community impact. And so really taking, sea level rise scenarios and putting those on the landscape and seeing how we end up creating hazard situations as we bring that and flooding together with infrastructure. And the challenge here was to find that decision-making relevant scale. And one of the ways that we got around that as part of the process is have a management transition advisory group that would help drive each aspect of the decision-making relevant scale as we move through the project. So from the biogeophysical modeling that was taking place through the work that we were doing, looking at creating the impacts or assessing the impacts on the human community, the built infrastructure, as well as individuals. All of that, at all aspects of that work, were driven by this management transition advisory group. So these are the individuals that would be taking that output and actually applying it in decision-making processes. So just to run through the example here, so we have these various sea level rise scenarios that over time change the 100-year still water floodplain. And this is one of the sections that we're working in. This is Mississippi. This is what we call our Section 3 analysis. And our job was to really begin to look at the impact on built infrastructure, and in particular damage and displacement of damage to built infrastructure and displacement of human communities. And so we were able to take census block polygons and match that up with the depth grid of the 100-year floodwaters, the still water elevations, 100-year flood still water elevations, and drive that model through Jesus with some added data and information that would give us then our impact on the human community. And so from that, what we are able to generate at a very decision-making relevant scale for those communities is looking at, and this is just one example, the building loss through 100-year flood, still water elevation flood plains of how these communities would be impacted. Now, the building loss itself is not as important as what you're losing in those buildings. So you're losing critical infrastructure, hospitals, schools, firehouses, wastewater treatment plants, etc. And you're also displacing individuals, and those individuals also need shelter. So we're able to, at a, once again, decision making relevant scale, show our management transition advisory group, the impact in their communities and how they might begin to think about mitigating, potential damages to their communities moving forward. So just to wrap up here, some of the takeaways from our experience that I'd like to share is, one, thinking about the challenges of scale can really help drive you to a decision-making relevant scale outcome, right? So thinking about what people will need to take up to impact livelihoods and human well-being within their communities. Number two, any modeling or scientific effort produces much better results when all parties, disciplines are in it from the beginning. I think this is critical. I applaud the effort here of this group in particular by including all these domains right from the beginning. I can't stress that enough. Those of us that work in the social, behavioral, and economic sciences are challenged constantly by being added into projects that are originate from the biogeophysical sciences at the end, and that's not the way to get really meaningful results. And I applaud this group for thinking about this from the beginning. And then three, think about your collaborators' needs constantly. So all those domains that you have identified need to continue to stay in contact with each other, to produce effective and relevant modeling output, rather than just stitching together those bins or domains at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, Dr. Yoskowitz, for that excellent presentation. And I know that will have a lot of reverberations throughout our work, thinking about particularly the scale challenges that you noted. I know that Igal and Christi also have thought about that a lot. So Igal, please, we'd like to turn to you next to share your screen and give us a deep dive into some of the work you've been doing.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting me for this webinar. My name is Ike Bernstein, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Claire Paris's lab at the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, University of Miami. And in this webinar, I'm not going to strictly talk about socioeconomics, but I'm going to give you an overview of some of our scientific products and the quantitative frameworks which we've constructed over the past years, and discuss how this can be used by management and response for real-time oil spill events. The work presented here was funded mainly by the National Academy of Sciences and GoMRI CMH Consortium, and includes many collaborators from multiple universities around the world listed below. So the framework is based on the oil CMS model, which computes the transport and fate of oil spill dynamics, considering key processes such as biodegradation, evaporation, multi-fraction droplets, surface wind transport, and more. Importantly, the oil CMS computes oil concentrations across time and space, which allowed us to produce a few meaningful spill-related applications relevant for management and response. Specifically, by comparing the decay dynamics of the in situ oil concentrations of surface waters to the decay dynamics of the Deepwater Horizon satellite footprint after the Macondo well was capped, we were able to compute the satellite visibility threshold in terms of oil concentrations. And when plugging that threshold into the model, we were able to reconstruct the area of the spill detected by satellite based on the model concentrations. Now, when looking both at the cumulative and the specific data extents, the model footprint matches in size and shape the observed satellite footprint. Similarly, based on the concentrations computed by the oil CMS model, we were able to compute toxic concentrations across time and space, according to which we could apply automatically fishery closures in hypothetical spills in the East and the West Gulf of Mexico. Then, based on these closures and based on vessel monitoring system data mapped at the county level, we were able to compute the revenue loss of bottom, longline, and bandit reel fisheries given these two hypothetical spills. Then, taking into account the county-specific social vulnerability index, which considers socioeconomic status, commercial and industrial development, family structure, etc., we compute the potential socioeconomic impact based both on revenue loss and social vulnerability index, such that in this plot, the red counties are both socially vulnerable and suffer high revenue loss. Orange counties suffer high revenue loss, but are not socially vulnerable. Blue counties are neither vulnerable nor suffer revenue loss, etc. Similarly, we use the oil CMS output to compute the effect of possible spills on the ecosystem based on the Atlantis model, mainly looking at biomass loss and time to biomass recovery. Finally, in order to compare between various scenarios, we came up with several additional meaningful spatial variables such as, for bases for comparison, which include sedimented mass, beached mass, beach shoreline length, and total oil area, toxic area, total volume, and toxic volume. In this case, we used 4 scenarios: the actual Deepwater Horizon, the Deepwater Horizon occurring during the fall, a spill at the East Gulf of Mexico, and a spill at the West Gulf of Mexico. And in order to be able to easily compare these scenarios, we ranked and color-coded them by severity. And you can easily see that the severity in this case is not conclusive between the scenarios. For example, in terms of sedimented mass, the Deepwater Horizon was the most impactful and the fall scenario was the least impactful. However, for the toxic volume, the Deepwater Horizon was the least impactful and the West Gulf of Mexico was the most impactful. Then we can also look at the trade-off dynamics or the correlation between the variables. For example, the beach mass is correlated to the beach length, the length of the oil shoreline, which makes sense. But at the same time, the beach length is negatively correlated to the oiled volume, which also makes sense because oil that reaches the shore is subtracted from the water column. Of course, this comparison and trade-off analysis can be applied to all variables mentioned before, including the effect on the ecosystem and the socioeconomic impact of fishery-dependent communities. To summarize, based on the oil CMS computed oil concentrations, we were able to produce multiple meaningful outputs. We were able to predict satellite detection based on modeled oil concentration, to compute daily toxic concentration extent, to automatically apply fishery closures, to compute fishery revenue loss and the socioeconomic impact. We were also able to compute the effect on the ecosystem based on the Atlantis model, and to compute a number of meaningful spatial variables, including sedimented and beached mass, shoreline length, total area and volume affected by the oil, and toxic area and volume affected by the oil. Now, based on all the above variables, we were able to perform a scenario comparison analysis and trade-off correlation analysis to effectively compare between various scenarios. Now, these outputs are relevant to all components of the core Area 7B framework and can be potentially useful for management. But are they really useful for management at the current state? Our next step is to try and work with spill management and response to make an optimal use of these products in real life. We envision that in coordination with management and response team, such framework can take part in routine oil spill drills and real-time events, committing to a few days preparedness for all variables mentioned before. Such near real-time output will be highly useful for oil spill response teams, management, stakeholders, and to coastal communities. And since such framework is based on completed products, adjusting them to various management needs will be both fast and at low cost. With a continuously increased anthropogenic pressure on natural resources in the Gulf of Mexico, the collaboration between science and management should maximize its effectiveness and make an optimal use of existing scientific products. Such framework will improve the ability to understand, respond to, and mitigate the impacts of oil pollution. It will promote science-based policy and management, and it will provide crucial information in near real time to promote informed decision-making. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening. I would like to thank our funders and our collaborators, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Dr. Berenshtein, thank you very much for that presentation. We will reserve questions for the end, so please do enter them in the chat box if anyone has questions. I think this presentation fits very nicely with our work and really enjoyed your comments on science for real-time decision-making, and some of the work that you've got planned there is exciting. So our final presentation, Igal, if you could stop sharing your screen, and Dr. Kort, if you would begin to share yours. We invite you to present on some of your work on socioeconomic modeling. Thank you. Krista, take it away.
All right, thank you guys, and I'm going to apologize up front. Right outside my window, they have started doing lawn maintenance, so if I have background noise, there's really nothing I can do about it at this point. But thank you to the 7B team for organizing this webinar. I'm happy to present at it. My name is Krista Kort. I'm an assistant scientist in the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida, and I'm also the assistant director of the Economic Impact Analysis Program. And I'm going to take a little bit of a high-level approach and get in a little bit of detail on some of the projects that we've done, but looking at socioeconomic impacts of oil spills through the lens of improving what I'm going to call translation and moving towards bidirectional integration modeling. If I can get on the right screen here. So. All right, are the slides advancing on your screen?
They sure are. Yep.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back to the same slide that David showed, and we're all familiar with, courtesy of John Shepard, and just look, take a little bit of a look at what we've identified already in terms of these connections between maybe the ecosystem models of socioeconomics or the human health aspect of things in socioeconomics, but then also make some suggestions in terms of additional considerations that I see from this standpoint. So some other thing, it's relatively obvious that we'll have seasonal or regional changes in fishery production after an oil spill, as well as those will translate into income, employment, and health impacts data. But there's also the potential to have changes in consumer preferences. So we see that even though the federal government or NOAA Fisheries has claimed that seafood is safe from the Gulf some period after an oil spill, there might still be consumers that aren't comfortable with that. So we can model those as well, and they will also impact markets in the area. This might result in changes in fish imports and exports. When the Gulf is not able to provide to the processors what it normally does, we might see the processors go elsewhere to get their seafood so that they stay in business. And this can actually result in the potential for a long-term loss of market share, or we might even think of place brands. So for oil on the beaches, if in the mind of consumers, if it's a highly popular topic in the media about how terrible this is, you might see changes in visitation that happen over a long period of time. Changes in non-fishing recreation. So we know that there's changes in fish, but there are also people that use beaches in the Gulf for other types of recreation that we're not going to capture if we look only at changes in commercial fishing production or recreational fishing activity. Also coastal property values, there's the potential for those to be impacted, whether or not that's a short-term impact or a long-term impact can be examined. David alluded to some of these methods that we are seeing in terms of environmental or resource economics, where we do look at changes in existence value and whether or not those would change due to an oil spill. And then there's also, when we look at disaster impact assessment, the potential for somewhat offsetting economic activity that's associated with cleanup. So you'll often see an increase in GDP in areas that have been impacted by a disaster due to a lot of the short-term construction spending that's going on. So those need to be considered and make sure that we know whether or not those are in the numbers that we're sharing with policymakers. So I'm going to argue throughout this presentation that there is a science, and I'll also call it an art, behind modeling the value of each of these. David alluded to it a little bit in his presentation in the fact that there is greater effort on the biogeophysical modeling realm, and I agree and can echo his suggestions that there are data and modeling expertise that exist that are perhaps not being sought out or not employed for a variety of reasons on these types of issues. So I'm going to call this translation and say that we need more translators, because we can do a much better job on the socioeconomic side as well. And I'd like to note that there are a lot of reports and publications out there on the economic impacts or socioeconomic impacts of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. But any one project is likely analyzing one or maybe only a few of these, but it's really important that we acknowledge the bigger picture, even in doing so, to acknowledge what is and is not in the numbers that we're providing to different types of stakeholders. So I'm also going to step into a little bit of consideration of scale, and David has done a good job of this, but I'm going to take thinking through scale from the perspective of socioeconomic modeling. So if we think about that spatial scale that he mentioned earlier, there's both a geography of the direct impacts of the oil spill, but there's also a geography of the broader impacts of the oil spill. So when I mentioned that there are potentially changes in consumer preferences or changes in trade or place brand that are occurring, those may not always occur at the directly impacted sites. So we need to think about that. And when we, as modelers, there's also what I'm going to call the geography of modeling. So where do I, as a modeler, draw the boundaries based on the research questions that I'm trying to answer? So do I need to only look at local impacts, state level impacts? We can do a multi-state region, as we saw here with the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf, or even national impacts where we're capturing some of the indirect impacts that are happening in other places due to direct impacts on the Gulf region. So also this temporal scale that you mentioned. So here I'm going to think on the consideration of time in terms of impacts. So there are immediate impacts that we'll see from an oil spill. There's some impacts that will last into what I'll call the short term or medium term. But then there's the potential for long-term impacts where we never, because of the oil spill or because of a disaster event of any kind, we never get back on the path, the development path that we were on prior to that. So when we're looking at these, we need to consider which of these types of impacts do we want to capture based on the research questions at hand. And I'm also going to talk about time in terms of modeling. So there are times when we need answers right now, and we just heard about that in the previous presentation, and how can we help in real time? But then there are other ways that we can model some of these impacts where we might need an answer within weeks or months or the long term. Now that we're almost a decade after Deepwater Horizon, we have 10 years of data that we can look at rather than just doing simulations in the near term after the impact. We can go back and test some of the modeling tools that we've developed in this last 10 years with those data, see how close they were, how can we do better ahead of the next time. So I'll call that one long-term, but I think these all sort of feed together where the long-term modeling 10 years after an event can certainly help in the real-time or now modeling for the next event, if we should have one. And David also mentioned the other types of scales. So these are, we saw in his slide on thinking at the jurisdictional scale or the institutional scale, the management scale. What is the decision-making process that we're trying to inform? Is that a local decision-making process? Is it a state-level process, federal, or even we could have international discussions if some of these things are happening in international waters? And we need to be, as David mentioned, we need to be very tuned into this because occasionally we will, as academics, step back and hope that we get a large funding project to build general knowledge on the subject, and then end up in a case where we aren't relevant to decision making that's going on. So if I step back and talk about what the work that we have done specific to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, I'm going to go through it very quickly, but there are certainly resources that I can provide if you want additional detail. One project that we had was to look at the impact on recreational tourism. So we specifically needed to investigate what happened due to canceled recreational trips to the Northwest Florida region, as well as a project where we worked with David's group to look at the impact on the commercial and recreational fishing. So if I speak about the first one, if we're looking at the economic impacts of canceled recreational trips to Northwest Florida after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we first came up with a conceptual model on how visitor spending is related to Florida's economy. So we can see that visitors, whether those are domestic visitors here in the US or from outside of that region, that they are spending money in what we'll call the travel or tourism sector. They're spending money on transportation, lodging, food service, recreation, and entertainment. And those dollars flow on to allied industries and the rest of the Florida economy, and they're creating jobs. They're creating money for Florida resident households that might also take recreational trips. And as well as local and state government tax revenues. So you'll see here in the dotted line that some of that spending was diverted by the oil spill, whether they chose to go to an alternate travel destination or just cancel their vacation altogether because the area of Northwest Florida that they were going to had been impacted by the oil spill. we've been talking about translation, then the next question is how do I translate those canceled trips into something that I can work with in a macroeconomic model in terms of the total of foregone spending that would have happened in Florida had it not been for the oil spill. So we went through a relatively rigorous survey process to determine where visitors were coming from, where visitors typically come from, how long would they stay, how much money would they spend, and we were able to look at the share of the trip spending that would have taken place in Northwest Florida, along with the average number of canceled trips per household based on the survey that we did. This is both past trips and future trips. And then that gives us an average lost visitor spending per household that would have taken place in Northwest Florida. We multiplied that by the number of survey responses that actually canceled a trip to Northwest Florida due to the oil spill, and then divided by the total number of survey respondents to get a percentage of those cancellations. We had a number of households in what we identified as the target market area. So where do visitors to this Northwest Florida region typically come from? And we were able to estimate the total foregone spending by spending categories that we could enter into a regional economic model to look at those broader impacts. I don't have slides, but the direct impacts here for this particular study were that we estimated 1.88 million planned visitor trips to Northwest Florida were canceled due to the oil spill. So this was within and up to a year after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and that those resulted in a loss of $1.3 billion in visitor spending in that Northwest Florida region. And those are just the direct impacts there, the estimated total foregone spending by category. If I step to the other project, we had to look at the economic impacts of changes in commercial and recreational fishing activity due to Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So we had output of an ecosystems model, the Atlantis model, that determined the temporal distribution of changes in commercial fishing catch by species, as well as recreational fishing effort. And we used those to translate into economic impacts for the northern Gulf of Mexico region. So you'll see the charts there on how those were changing under a no oil spill scenario versus an oil spill scenario. And between 2010 and 2020, we estimated that commercial fishing catch for all species modeled was estimated to decrease by 475,000 metric tons, and that was a value of about $700 million. On the recreational fishing side, there was $600 million in foregone recreational fishing expenditures as a result of the oil spill. And if you'll notice there on the chart, the recreational effort doesn't return to pre-oil spill levels within the time period that we investigated. So this is looking at those long-term shifts. In both of these cases, we used something called an input-output or social accounting matrix methods, largely due to budget and time constraints. Occasionally, we're asked to come in at the very end of a project and are just working with what is already available. But the pros to doing this are that it's transparent and defensible. It's a relatively well-known method in a lot of decision-making circles. And there's readily available data to do it and software tools. But the downside to using these methods for looking at some of these medium to long-term impacts is that they rely on fixed price relationships. So if there are short-term marginal impacts, not a big issue, but if there are medium to long-term impacts that are non-marginal and prices are changing, then these are violating the assumptions of the model, and we should be working in a dynamic modeling framework. There's also fixed relationships between the sector's outputs and its inputs, and it's a static model. So we're looking at the relationships as they existed in the most recent year that data are available. So we've got quite a bit of trade-off between speed and accuracy here. Some of the continued work that we're doing is in response to a lot of these cons, so trying to put ourselves in a situation where that isn't the only tool available to us when we get some of these calls. So we have a proposal in to NOAA Restore for what we call the Gulf of Mexico Space-Time Regional Economic Analysis Model, so the Gulf Stream. And it'll be a state-of-the-art, up-to-date modeling framework to consistently forecast these regional economic impacts that are associated with trends and variability in living in coastal marine sources, and that could include disaster impact analysis. Will support effective management, long-term sustainability of, it's a complex dynamic system, so we should have a dynamic model where we can do impacts forecasting. And I also mentioned the potential to move towards bidirectional relationships. So I'm going to go back to this chart here at the beginning and note that we can add arrows here going the other direction. So if I'm thinking about commercial fishing, for instance, what is going on in the commercial fishing industry, especially over a 5 or 10 year period, it could also potentially impact the ecosystem. So, the models that we're using on the ecosystem side are providing inputs to the socioeconomic modeling, but we should also be adding feedback effects so that those things are determined simultaneously, and we can get to the point where we're looking at how the socioeconomic changes are impacting the ecosystem as well, not just due to the oil spill, but due to changes that have followed on from the oil spill. And I don't normally end with a quote either, but I'm going to do it in this case. So I have, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. And I think that's definitely the case with the 4 boxes that we've seen here. And we should be remembering that social and economic systems are included there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Dr. Kort, is an excellent presentation that gives us a lot to think about, and a lot of complications to an already complicated system, but certainly helped us to think about the accuracy and trade-offs within the modeling framework that you work with. So thank you for going into depth there. And thank you to all of our presenters for preparing and sharing their time and insights with us as we think about this integrated model. I'd also briefly like to thank, of course, GoMRI, the organizing committee for 7B, the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which is helping to organize these talks, and of course, Helena Solo Gabrielle at the University of Miami, who is helping to lead the organizing committee and is putting in a lot of effort to do a good job. I do not see any questions or discussion points come up in the chat box, so I'll pause. We have just a few minutes left to see if anybody wants to contribute a question. Seems folks are chewing on this food for thought. Well, then I have a question, given that we have just a couple of minutes. Krista, I understand the limitations of the model for accuracy and incorporating medium to long-term impacts. But one question I had while you were talking, here in Texas, of course, we're still recovering from Hurricane Harvey, and one of the linkages that I see anecdotally between socioeconomics and human health is this tourism revenue tax, which is, of course, as you mentioned, used for local and state, and especially local governments, the hotel occupancy tax, and that the offsets to that tax, or the lack of that tax, because of the huge impacts to tourism in some coastal towns along Texas that haven't been able to get their hotels and tourism industry up and running, have impeded their ability to provide social programs that really provide the fabric, the underpinning for some of their human well-being programs and action. So I wonder if not in the model, Krista, but if you know of any studies or case studies or deep dives or something like that that investigate the impacts to that tourism tax and reverberations in the ability of the local governments to provide various programs.
Yeah, so I don't know of any specific references or resources. I know that our model can provide information on what exactly those losses in taxes are. So when we usually we'll talk about decreases in sales revenue, and the big one that folks want to hear is the decrease in jobs supported. One of the other, I would say the third most important is to look at changes in state and local tax contributions. We normally report those as totals for all taxes, but we do have some information on the breakdown of how those contributions are made. I don't know if we could get as explicit as tourism tax, but we could certainly get a lot closer. And then you can use additional information on, how have these local governments recently spent those dollars to inform what is likely to be cut or what is likely to change because of that. And that's certainly important. And I think that's another one of these things that we're not doing a very good job of right now. We are communicating those changes in tax contributions, but we're not going that extra step to communicate the potential impact on other community or human well-being factors due to those changes in contributions.
Interesting, thank you.
So I'll add one more thing, that the federal government used to collect data on how state and local governments were spending that money that we had as an additional data source, and that is no longer collected.
Interesting, okay. Okay, thank you. And time for maybe one more question quickly. Igal, so Dr. Yoskowitz talked about the Management Transition Advisory Group, and you talked about in your upcoming work working for science for real-time decision-making with oil spill and response. So at what level are those decision makers that you're considering involving? Is it federal, state, local, or a mix in between?
Well, I think it can be helpful for both. And yeah, that's what we're looking for. We're looking to cooperate with any management level that these products can be helpful for them.
Well, it's certainly important work. We are at time, so thank you again, everybody, for participating and joining us today. One last reminder, well, two actually. Again, we have a virtual working session this Thursday, so please contact me if you're interested in attending. And then the final physics webinar to investigate the components of the physics, quote-unquote, box will be held on May 28th at 10 a.m. Eastern, so we also invite you to attend that webinar. Thank you again to our presenters, and everybody have a good Monday.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Katya.